Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today, we delve into a slightly controversial topics, the myths surrounding the topic of terrorism, the war on terror, all things jihadi. There's been a lot of literature, a lot of professional analytical work on this topic, and yet it seems to be that many of the experts cannot agree on some very basic issues and concerns. Why that is, we'll be exploring today with Phil Gurski, who is the Director of Intelligence and Security at the SEC Dev Group, who previously served as a senior strategic analyst in the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and who is an author of several books addressing these very topics: terrorism, jihadism, religion and terror, and all these good things. Welcome, Phil. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Irina, for having me on. Just a bit of clarification. I'm no longer the Director of Security at the SecDev Group. I was a couple of years ago. So now I'm just my own corporate Borealis threat and risk consulting. But everything else you said about me is true.
Excellent. Thank you. And so tell us a little about how you got involved in all this work, what you were doing with the Canadian intelligence, how you decided to focus on terrorism, and why are you continuing with this to be interested in these issues to this day when the topic appears to be passé? Everyone's moved on to Russia and China.
It's a good question. I actually started my career in intelligence very serendipitously or haphazardly. I had graduated from university way back in 1982, 83, and was looking for employment. I spoke a number of languages, and I happened to apply for a position with what I thought was the Canadian Department of National Defense. I was successful in my application. When I arrived in Ottawa in the summer of 1983, I was told it's not really national defense. It's something called Communication Security Establishment, or CSE, which is Signals Intelligence. Of course, they didn't advertise back then. It's a very secretive organization. I spent 17 and a half years there as a multilingual analyst, specialized in the Middle East because I could read and understand Farsi and Arabic. And then in 2001, in January, I moved to the Canadian Security Intelligence Service as a strategic analyst, again on the Middle East. And that, of course, was the year that 9/11 happened. And because of my knowledge on the Middle East, my knowledge of Arabic, my appreciation for Middle Eastern culture and history, I quickly became involved in looking at terrorism, and more specifically Islamist terrorism or jihadism, as you said, and then worked on hundreds of cases in Canada and around the world for 15 years. Retired from the security service in 2015. That's the year my first book came out, The Threat from Within, which is all about radicalization, what it looks like. And then since that book came out, I wrote more on terrorism. So I've written a total of 6 books on terrorism. The most recent is A History of Terrorism in Canada from 1867 to the present. And so it's something I still have a passion for because, as you said, there's a lot of opinions out there. There's a lot of analysis out there. And I find a lot of that analysis is not good. I find a lot of people claim to have an expertise in this field, and I don't agree with them. And as you also mentioned, everybody wants to talk about Russia and China, and yet terrorism is still a very, very important threat globally. Maybe not so much here in Canada or in the United States, but around the world, jihadis still kill more than 10,000 people a year. And that's a significant threat that I think we have to keep an eye on.
So, actually, I wanted to ask you, how did you learn Arabic and Farsi before you ended up where you ended up? Usually, a lot of people learn those languages after, but what drew you to them to begin with?
I always had a talent for languages. I knew that when I was in secondary school and university. I took courses in about 8 different languages. I could learn languages quickly. I also developed an interest in linguistics. Ended up doing doctoral studies in linguistics in the 1990s, linguistics for 15 years, part-time in Ottawa while I was working for the intelligence service. So for me, it was sort of, I guess, putting the cart before the horse in the sense that my passion for languages, how language works, facilitated my ability to look at issues in which the information that was available to understand those issues was in different languages. So I actually became an Iranian specialist for almost 20 years, fluent in Farsi, understood Iranian history, Iranian culture. Of course, Iran has been a very, shall we say, problematic country for the past 40, almost 45 years since the Ayatollah Khomeini took over from the Shah. And so once I had the languages down, it gave me an insight into history, culture, how the people think. And then again, when 9/11 happened, of course, Al Qaeda in Afghanistan at the time is an Arabic speaking group. A lot of their propaganda is produced in Arabic. And I found that understanding the language helped me to understand the ideology that was driving Al Qaeda. So you have to go look back into history. They would often cite sources from the 14th century. Without that knowledge, you don't really understand why Al Qaeda did what it did. You don't understand the raison d'etre, the reason why they think they have to do these things. And so my linguistic abilities and my linguistic interest definitely facilitated my later interest and then specialization in Islamist terrorism.
I'm going to ask you about your opinion about one particular group of people who claim to be experts on radicalization and terrorism, and I was inspired to think about this by an Egyptian analyst who wrote an article about this very phenomenon. As essentially, his point was that many former radicals, people who held pro-jihadist views, who could or who could have themselves been terrorism and sometimes were or were not, they are not necessarily experts on the phenomenon of terrorism, even though they are held out as such. Is that true, or does the process of being radicalized give some unique academic insight that is impossible to gain as an outsider otherwise?
I think it depends. The one thing we learned about radicalization, and more narrowly, Islamist extremist radicalization, is that it's a very complicated process. People often say, well, it's all about discrimination, it's all about poverty, it's all about colonialism, it's all about X, Y, or Z. And we found that wasn't true. We found that, in fact, in the Canadian setting, the vast majority of people who radicalized were middle income, mostly university graduates. So it wasn't that they had nothing else to do, which is often the argument you hear in Mali, Niger, Somalia. It's the lower classes. They've been shunted to the outside by governments. There's no opportunities. They have no choice but to become jihadis. In terms of understanding radicalization, I have definitely met some people whom, at one point we would have considered radicalized, and then appear, and I stress appear, to have stepped back from that ideology. So some do have an insight, some have an understanding of what it was that led them there in the first place. But because the process is so variable, and it's variable to the extent where it's individualized, every person goes there for different reasons. There's some grand themes that you can talk about: hatred for the West, a belief the West is trying to destroy Islam. Take the recent Quran burnings right now in Sweden and Denmark. Al Qaeda has just issued threats against Denmark, saying Denmark must be punished for allowing the Quran to be burned. So there's this intense hatred for all these Westerners. The Taliban in Afghanistan, they're banning females from schools, from television. They're burning instruments because instruments are Western things that we shouldn't be allowed in an Islamic society, et cetera, et cetera. But I would just be careful in trying to summarize radicalization in one or two phrases. So when you come across somebody who claims to have the answer for radicalization, I would just be cautious because there is no one answer for this. As I said, it is extremely variable across individuals. Irina, I keep an open mind. I'll listen to anybody at first claims to have knowledge on X, Y, or Z. But sometimes I find, you know what, that knowledge isn't all that deep, or there's an agenda that they're trying to play here, and I can kind of see through it. So never eliminate information immediately. Take a look at it, judge it for yourself. Is it valid? Is it credible? And if so, that's somebody you might want to engage with.
As someone with your experience of analyzing communications, analyzing all this data in foreign languages, in the native languages of these people who speak it, what are some of the red flags that give away this ulterior agenda when you're reading or hearing some analysis or some presentation?
Right. So again, my analysis was based on Canadian cases, so that's important to recognize that other countries might experience things differently. But I think there are some general trends, some general themes that we discovered. So people that are beginning to adopt these ideologies and hence pose a threat to society, Asian, African, European, North American, whatever society, we find a couple things in common. First of all, they are convinced that the West is at war with Islam, that the West wants to eliminate and destroy Islam. They also see themselves as the only true Muslims. In other words, friends, family, imams, learned people who are Muslim, these people say, no, you're not, because you're doing it wrong. My way is the only way to Islam. So if you don't believe in what I believe in, you're not actually a Muslim. And in actual fact, the vast majority of victims of terrorist attacks in the world carried out by Islamist terrorists are other Muslims. They don't see them as Muslims. For example, jihadis tend to be Sunni, so there's Sunni versus Shia Islam is the main dividing point in Islam. As far as the Sunnis are concerned, Shias are apostates, they're unbelievers, they deserve to be killed. And so you get this real intolerance, this notion that I'm the only person who understands the faith, and I will force you to follow my way. If you don't follow my way, I have the right to kill you. I have a divine right. In fact, they call it divine obligation in the literature, in the propaganda that they use. You also find people, what they do is they will avoid people with whom they disagree and only associate with those who have the same views that they do. So we look at it, we used to tell people, if somebody's beginning to isolate, stop talking to friends, family, associates, workmates, whatever, and only around people who seem to have an agenda. That's usually a very good sign that they're on a path to themselves as part of an inner group that has a mission to Islam from it. That's the bottom line, is they're convinced Islam's under attack. And they claim they're
You're breaking
the ones
up.
defending Islam.
The
Sorry, so they really...
The last few sentences have been really, really broken up. If you could just maybe repeat the last few sentences.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
There is something with the connection for some reason.
Connection is not great. Yeah, sometimes it just doesn't get all that great. So essentially, what these people are convinced is that they have a monopoly on what is Islam and what is not Islam. And their version of Islam demands that anybody who does not believe in the same version that they believe in deserves to die. And that includes fellow Muslims, it includes Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, it doesn't matter. They really believe, they believe in a concept called fard ain, which is an individual obligation to do something. And people often say that, what jihadis have nothing to do with Islam. They have everything to do with Islam, but it's what we would call a non-normative or non-mainstream version. To those who claim that Islam is absent from jihadism, my simple response to that is, look at their propaganda. They cite the same Quran that you do. They cite the same hadith, which are the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, as you do. They just interpret them differently. And they do think that their interpretation is superior to that of anybody else. You have this intense, almost an arrogance that I'm the only person, or myself and my friends are the only people that understand what's going on and what has to be done about it.
No, that's very interesting because in some cases, some of these jihadis, like al-Baghdadi, have doctorates and degrees in Islamic studies, and in other cases, we have individuals from various parts of the world who can't even read Quran in Arabic, and sometimes who've never even read it. So there's a huge degree of the level of actual familiarity with the text, and yet you have all these very different people with very different backgrounds drawing the same conclusions or willing to come to the same um, posture on this issue.
It's a good point. That's why I say, radicalization to violence is very individualistic. It's also important to point out, Irina, radicalization itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Many people have said that, some of the most positive changes in global history come from radical thinking. Think about, the end of slavery. Think about women's rights. Think about animal rights, et cetera, et cetera. These are all radical views at one point.
Mm-hmm.
It only becomes problematic when violence is involved, when you think that your radical view is entitled to use violence. On the issue of someone like al-Baghdadi versus somebody who is not even literate, what we also found is that most people need somebody to follow. And what these people have in common, they may not all be doctors, they may not all have the same educational or financial background. What we find is they have charismatic personalities, which means they can draw somebody in, they can convince you to do certain things, and they can maintain that hold over you, that influence over you, so that at the end of the day, you will do whatever they ask you to do. I mean, and charisma is a very powerful human element. Just think, most leaders and most successful leaders in human history have been charismatic. They can convince people through their dialogue, through their psychology, through the way they do things. We humans like to follow people whom we admire, people whom we respect. And this is why bin Laden was so successful and why al-Baghdadi was so successful. And the list goes on and on and on. You have leaders that are able to use their skills to convince people why they should be followed and why they should do things in the name of the terrorist movement, in the name of Islam, in the name of Allah, whatever you want to say, however you want to frame it. They're able to use that skill set that they have to bring people along with them.
I found a very strange dichotomy in the dynamic of terrorist organizations. On the one hand, they have a surprising degree of flexibility in terms of forming alliances and working with different groups, often with completely different views, and that goes for both violent terrorists and also assorted other less involved functionaries. On the other hand, there's a high degree of infighting over dogma, as one could imagine, and a degree of fluidity in these organizations and high turnover rate and so on and so forth. How do you explain this contradiction, the simultaneous ability to build these, vast, sometimes unimaginable alliances, breaking all stereotypes and, and being extremely pragmatic and self-serving, but at the same time fighting over sometimes minutia and things that often even have nothing to do with the religion, so much as resources and just power and influence.
I think that's a good point. I think it often reduces to personalities. So look at ISIS right now. So Islamic State, was an Al Qaeda affiliate. It was called Al Qaeda in Iraq. It was formed after the U.S. invasion in 2003. There was no Al Qaeda in Iraq before then. Saddam Hussein was not linked to Al Qaeda, which was one of the allegations made by the Bush administration as a justification for invading Iraq. So Al Qaeda in Iraq was formed in the wake of the invasion to get Americans. And that's a common theme amongst jihadists. If you have a foreign presence, a foreign army comes into your country, tries to establish dominance or whatever, you'll often find people creating groups to get those people out. In other words, you invaded my country, I'm going to use violence to get you to leave. So there definitely were links between Al Qaeda and ISIS in the very beginning. Then, because of personalities, Islamic State, once it had created the caliphate back in 2014, their methodology was so brutal. I mean, videotaping beheadings, mass rapes, mass killings, even Al Qaeda, that was too much for Al Qaeda. And so you get this split. We don't want to be associated with you. Our form of terrorism, speaking as Al Qaeda, we're more sophisticated. We're more mature. You're just violence for the sake of violence. And occasionally you do see coalitions that last a certain amount of time. Looking at what's happening in Nigeria right now. So the primary terrorist group in Nigeria is a group called Boko Haram. They've been around since the late 2000s. They've killed tens of thousands of Nigerians, displaced well over 1 million people over the last 15 years. Well, now there's a rival. It's called Islamic State West African Province. And Islamic State, in the aftermath of the Caliphate, was able to spawn a number of provinces, probably about 20 around the world, some more successful than others. And now Islamic State West African Province and Boko Haram are basically clashing. And sometimes you see terrorists killing terrorists for dominance, for territory, for influence, for resources, for material, or whatever. So it is complicated. And again, I think what it reduces to is that personality clashes get involved. I mean, think of something. Go back to the Second World War, right? You had the alliance between Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese Emperor. That was a very difficult alliance to maintain because of the personalities involved, Hitler being so dominant, kind of thing. So it should come as no surprise that when it comes to terrorist groups, that yes, on occasion they will collaborate because it's in both their interest to do so. But after a time, each person or each group wants to be the dominant one. They want to be the alpha personality. And as a consequence, you see a lot of splitting. So, whenever I see terrorists killing terrorists, I kind of smile because they're kind of doing our job for them, or for us rather. And if terrorist groups are killing terrorist groups, then that's a good thing because there are a few terrorists around to kill innocent people.
Speaking of alliances and very strange bedfellows, one of the common tropes that persists to this day, and I've personally spoken to US diplomats with Middle Eastern backgrounds who held such views, is that there is no common ground between Shia-backed and Sunni-backed terrorists and radicals and movements, despite all the evidence that has come out to the contrary. The texts of the Muslim Brotherhood translated to Farsi in Iran, the Al-Qaeda's various forms of backing, again by Iran, the issues in the history of all these movements in Sudan, we have seen a lot of different variations. Still, these views perceived on a very formal level, and we're not talking about lay people who don't read anything, we're talking about professionals in the field. How does this myth has become so grounded in the political culture and discourse?
One of the good things, bad things that's occurred over the past 20 years is that since 9/11, you've had an explosion, no pun intended, in terrorism studies. Prior to 9/11, very few people cared about terrorism. It's a very niche study.
Mm-hmm.
Not that terrorism didn't exist. Of course, terrorism existed before 9/11, but it wasn't as popular. I mean, 9/11 was such a catastrophic event. 3,000 people killed in one attack. Never happened before. At the heart of America, New York City, Washington. It was just such an enormous occurrence that a lot of people decided to take a look at it, who hadn't historically. And that's been good. You've had some very good people. I have dozens of friends in academia whom I have a great respect for, who understand the languages, the cultures, the background, and have come up with some really interesting ideas. On the other hand, when something basically results from nothing, in other words, the field is completely brand new or next to brand new, lots of people who enter it aren't very good. And now, I mean, how many papers have there been on terrorism in the past 20 years? Hundreds of thousands, if not more. How many books have been written on terrorism? Thousands of books on terrorism. And they're not all of them are very good. Some of them are too theoretical. Some of them have biases. Some of them are written very quickly to try to account for a phenomenon. So the literature, when it comes to academic literature, is variable. It's inconsistent. And when you speak to the whole Shia-Sunni thing, as I said, it's true. To Sunni extremists, Shia are almost the worst enemies because they have corrupted Islam. They've taken Islam in the wrong direction. They don't believe in the same basic principles as Sunni Muslims do. But as you've seen in Palestine since the early 1980s, you've got a group called Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and it has cooperated with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which are Sunni groups in the West Bank and Gaza. So if you've got a common enemy, in this case, the common enemy is Israel, of course you're going to have cooperation because the ends are the same. In other words, they can set aside their differences, even if there is some a dislike on the parts of the Sunnis as to what the Shias stand for, we can set that aside because we're focusing on Israel right now. We want to hit Israel. We want to punish Israel. We want Israel to deoccupy the West Bank and Gaza. We want Israel to grant the Palestinians an independent state. And I think that has often happened in history, is the old phrase, right? The enemy is my friend. And I think that's exactly what's happened in Palestine. With Iran, same thing. I mean, Iran can the fact that Al-Qaeda members have been in Iran for a very long time, Al-Qaeda or Iran can use that as a bargaining chip against the Americans, against the West, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a calculation that goes on, Irina, when it comes to people that, on the one hand, you would very, very hesitate to say they would cooperate, but when the circumstances dictate it, I think there are other types of things apply, and as a consequence, they can sort of set aside these differences for a greater cause.
So interestingly enough, most people seem to think of terrorism as an exclusively Middle Eastern based phenomenon that resulted from actually Islamism seems to be the issue that comes to mind the most, although before there was Hamas and all these suicide squads coming from those directions, we have seen a completely a-religious form of terrorism that was very much backed by the Soviet Union. And we can recall that originally a lot of the terrorism came from Russia before the Soviet Union even. It came from the terrorist cells who used political violence as a form of pressure. And this connection between the evolution of terror as a political tactic seems to have escaped most discourse about contemporary terrorism. To what extent do you think it's still important, and why do you think there's this disconnect about the way some of these tactics and approaches and radicalization has been transferred over politically through particular alliances and particular influences?
We as humans like to make things simple. We don't like when things become too complex. What you're referring to is, there's a man that I know, I respect him greatly. I had him on a podcast several years ago. His name is David Rappaport. He's a professor of political science at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. I think he's still alive. He was in his 90s when I last talked to him. He came up in the early 2000s with a fascinating framework called the wave theory of terrorism. And he looked at terrorism over history, starting basically in the middle of the 19th century. Because before then, yes, there was terror. It gets harder to quantify before that time. But he essentially said there was 4 major waves of terrorism that have lasted about 2 generations, about 40 years, ever since the latter half of the 19th century. That first wave of terrorism was what he called the anarchist wave. And it's exactly what you're referring to. The anarchist wave of terrorism may not have started in Russia, pre-Soviet Union, but it had a very strong presence in Russia. We had czars assassinated, we had bombs, we had gunfights, we had all kinds of things. And the anarchist wave of terrorism was the dominant wave of the latter half of the 19th century, up until about the end of the First World War. Presidents, prime ministers, kings were all assassinated by anarchists. And they had this phrase that they developed called the propaganda of the deed, meaning that what we're doing, we don't have to, we can write manifestos, we can write books, we can write pamphlets. We're going to show you what we mean. And this is what they did, is they took part in very, very high profile assassinations. And it was a great concern for the law enforcement and military at the time to identify these people. Now, the wave theory claims that these waves, they start, they have a peak, and then they kind of ebb away. The problem is that there are still anarchist groups around nowadays. They're not the same anarchist groups from the 19th century, but they're still a concern for law enforcement and national security forces. So terrorism does ebb and flow over time. The one thing that really worries me, and I see this more and more in so-called expert analyses, is that Islamist terrorism is no longer important. And here in Canada, for example, nobody wants to talk about it. All they want to talk about is the far right. So neo-Nazism, fascism, white supremacy, white nationalism. And there's no question that that's a dangerous phenomenon. We have had terrorist attacks in Canada carried out by people that you would say are on the far right of the political spectrum. But two things about that. First of all, there's also far-left terrorism, and nobody's talking about that. So environmental groups that have decided that the only way to get attention over global warming, climate change, is to use violence. Nobody wants to talk about that. We in Canada have what we call First Nations, Indigenous people, who feel that they have been treated by the Canadian government, which in many ways is true, and there's used acts of violence to sort of get back at the Canadian government. That's not far right. In fact, if anything, it's far left. The other thing, of course, is that going back to terrorism, as I said earlier, 90% of all terrorist attacks carried out today, August of 2023, anywhere in the world, are carried out by jihadis. Look at the news. What's happening in Syria, in the Sahel, in Nigeria, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and Syria, plots that have been foiled in Europe, in the United States. We in Canada has had 2 arrests in the last couple of months of jihadis that were planning attacks of terrorism somewhere in the world. So we seem to have sort of said, well, ISIS doesn't have the caliphate, bin Laden's dead, al-Zawahiri may or may not be dead. I've seen competing theories on that. But jihadis are still the dominant form of terrorism, and they have been for the past 40 to 50 years. And it worries me that things something. In other words, put all of our eggs in the far right basket, put all of our resources looking at the far right. No, we can't. We look at all of them simultaneously, and that becomes a drain on your resources and on your funding, because you only have so many people to do investigations, only so many people to do surveillance, only so many people to listen to intercepted telephone calls or emails, whatever kind of thing. As I said, terrorism has been around for a long time. It'll be with us for a long time. And we got to get away from simplistic descriptions of what terrorism is and what it isn't. We can agree on what terrorism even means. That's problem number one. There is no agreed definition on what terrorism is. I use the definition that I provide in the Canadian Criminal Code. Canadian is basically an act of violence, serious act of violence, based on some kind of ideology, politics. That's not a great definition. It's the one I use, but I think that people are spreading the notion of what a terrorist is to think they're most definitely not terrorism. I call them hate crimes. So if you attack a Muslim because you hate Muslims, that's not necessarily terrorism. You might not be ideologically motivated. You just hate Muslims for a reason. Or you've heard probably of violent cells, people that kill women because they can't form relationships. That's not terrorism. That's hate. That's misogyny. And it's like Nigeria, they're calling ordinary criminals terrorists. So when we don't use the terms properly, we confuse the issue. I wish I could tell you, Irina, that there's a consensus on what terrorism is. There's no such consensus. Find out in Europe has found 200 definitions of terrorism amongst governments and academic institutions. So if you've got 200 definitions of one word, you see the problem that we're having.
One of the issues that I've seen, another of common tropes, is that right-wing extremists and right-wing terrorists cannot possibly cooperate with the Islamist terrorists, because right-wing extremists will naturally hate Muslims or anyone of that descent. I have reason to see that it is not necessarily true. We all we have to do is go back decades to Nazi interactions with some of the Islamists, and we don't have to think that far ahead. We can talk about any number of militia groups willing to at least engage in weapons trade, if not cooperation of certain to a certain level, and frankly truly conservative right-wing groups who are socially conservative will probably find more in common with Islamist groups than with some secular opponents of jihadism. So my question is, why is it that there are these blind spots about the potentials for cooperation? And I want to follow up with a very strange case, not Canadian, but I'm sure you've heard of it, which is the Christchurch, New Zealand case, which to this day I still do not understand. There's been many different issues, and it was never fully explain to the public? And I'm curious about your opinion about all of that.
Yeah, we again, not only do humans want simple answers, they want to compartmentalize things. They want to categorize things. And so if you suggest that groups which on the surface appear to be completely different, like far right and Islamist groups, can possibly collaborate, then people don't want to hear that because it makes things messier. It makes things harder to understand. But you're right on two levels, I would say. First of all, far right groups and Islamist groups have the first thing they have in common is anti-Semitism, right? So you see attacks on synagogues, you see attacks on Jews, et cetera, because of this intense hatred of being Jewish. Both groups share that. Secondly, you're talking about social conservatism. And there's no question that there are far-right groups that are very conservative in terms of their political ideology. So they would be, anti-LGBTQ, they would be anti-woke, they would be anti-cancel culture, they would be anti a whole bunch of things, women's rights, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe climate change and that'll be thrown in there as well. And a lot of Islamist groups are also that way. I mean, Islamist groups are also anti-LGBTQ. They're also against women's rights. Look at the Taliban in Afghanistan. There's one of the most vehement misogynist groups on the planet, and they're the government of Afghanistan right now. They're also a terrorist group. So there are definitely ways in which you can see, if outright collaboration, cooperation, at least sort of a gentle nod. Yeah, I support what you're doing. And I've seen cases as well in the past of individuals who have taken part in terrorist attacks who may have had some logistic assistance from people outside of the cell itself, who may have, have some things in common. And sometimes it's purely a financial transaction. You need weapons for this attack? Well, we've got this attack. That was the case of the bombs in Madrid in 2004. 2004. They killed 192 people. Explosives that were used by the jihadis in Madrid were obtained by a non-jihadi group. It was purely a financial transaction. They needed the explosives. They found someone to provide them. They did that kind of thing. So, in further question, it is. I think that we have a hard time understanding that circumstances often dictate your decisions. And if you find that a certain group or individual with a certain ideology is best placed to assist you in meeting your goals, in achieving your ends, well, you're going to work with them. Even if from a pure philosophical perspective, you may have very, very different views. So it's really dangerous when we, I say is never. You say, well, that would never happen. Well, you'd be surprised. As you said, look back in history, the relationship between Nazi Germany and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in the 30s and 1940s. There's no question that I think circumstances dictate the decisions that you make. And as a consequence, you will reach out to whomever you think can better assist you in achieving your goals.
And that brings me again to that very strange incident in New Zealand, that deadly terrorist attack by an individual who appeared to have traveled all over and has been interacting with North Koreans. Has been to various Muslim countries and so on and so forth. What was that story? Why haven't we received a full explanation about his background, how he managed to get to all these places, and how did it all come together to that attack?
Right. I would say, I can't draw a definitive conclusion yet because I don't have the data in front of me. But I would say two things. First of all, is that we are all the culmination of our experiences. So the New Zealand attacker, Brendan Tarrant, as you said, had been all over the world, taking a bit of philosophy here, a bit of knowledge here, and whoever he was that day was the culmination of everything he had. Just in the same way that you're the culmination of your life experiences, as am I. The second thing, which I think is important, you look at the Christchurch attack. That was not rocket science. 9/11 was rocket science. You have to have people at least have a cursory knowledge of how to fly a plane. if only to turn it around and, plow it into a building. You had to have the finances. You had to have, that was years in the making, 9/11. Something like the Christchurch attack could be planned that same morning or maybe a day in advance. Okay, oh, by the way, there's a mosque down the street. Oh, by the way, I've noticed people going for prayer at this time. And oh, by the way, I know somebody I can get a gun from. So, like Brendan Tarrant could easily, without any assistance from anybody else, done the necessary surveillance, which would have been minimal. We're not years in the making here. We're talking hours at most. Had access to weaponry, showed up unexpectedly, obviously, and started killing people. Islamic State has a really interesting phrase that they use. I call it the Nike form of terrorism. Just do it. Islamic State, whatever you can do. If you can, drive a car into a crowd, just do it. I.e., Barcelona in 2017. If you have a kitchen knife, go into a cafeteria, start stabbing people. We had an attack in South Korea just a couple of weeks ago. We're not quite sure what the motive is. If you have access to a gun, use it, as in the Bataclan and Stade de France attacks in 2015. Terrorism is stupidly simple nowadays. Yes, at the greater end, you have flying planes in the buildings, killing thousands, but at the unsophisticated end, you can use almost anything. We had an attack in Canada a couple of years ago, an unsuccessful attack, as it turned out, by a woman who basically picked up a golf club in a hardware store. She was an ISIS returnee, and she wanted to kill people with a golf club. Now, I'm sure you could kill somebody with a golf club if you hit them enough times over the head, but she didn't even own the golf club. She picked it up off the sporting section of the hardware store before she started using it. This is how terrorism, I think, has changed since 9/11. That was a pinnacle which may never be repeated again. And if you recall back then, there were a lot of concerns about terrorists getting hold of nuclear devices, a dirty bomb, a radioactive bomb, for example. And that, I'm sure that keeps a lot of people awake at night, security, intelligence, law enforcement, governments. But they don't have to do that. If they pull it off, then that's good for them. But that's rocket science. Building a radioactive bomb is rocket science. But I just saw Oppenheimer with my son at the theater. Building a bomb is rocket science. It doesn't happen overnight. But as a terrorist, you do that. All you have to do is pick up any weapon at all. And when you start seeing people driving trucks into crowds, and in effect weaponizing a truck, you understand how simple terrorism has become.
Now, there seems to be a lot of confusion because there's the stereotype that the terrorists are looking to create as much noise as possible, that nothing short of mass scale events will do. And if you don't have those massive waves of huge attacks as we've seen in Europe in a decade ago, then it means that it's basically passé, and those smaller attacks don't really matter. And basically another issue is that there's basically an undeclared understanding that the security services have prevailed, that the access to these more serious weapons and methods of planning have been cut off, and therefore there's very little left to worry about if all you're doing is catching, some knife attacker here and there, as opposed to a massive explosion in a nightclub or something like that. To what extent is this accurate, and to what extent are we missing something? Because to me, something doesn't feel right, because with all due respect and all the credit to international law enforcement cooperation and the like, it seems to me that if people want to evade or divert attention, distract, and cause serious damage, they still could.
And they still are. You look what's happening around the world. There was an attack in Sri Lanka in 2019 that killed 300 people. There was attacks in Somalia around the same time that killed 500 people. I mean, the mass casualty attacks have not ended. I read every day where a couple dozen are killed here, a couple dozen killed there, often with automatic weapons or whatever. Irina, if you work in security, intelligence, or law enforcement, you do what you can to prevent any attack. Obviously, you want to prevent the bigger attacks because of the effect. We can't afford another 9/11. I'm not sure what it would do to our psychology, to our emotions to see another 9/11 happen. But on the other hand, imagine the following scenario. Imagine you're living in a major city, anywhere in the world, a major city. And let's say on Monday, you see a vehicular attack that kills 5 people and injures 20. The following Monday, another vehicular attack kills 15, wounds 40. The third Monday, another vehicular attack kills 3 and wounds 10. What does that do to the mentality of the people in that city? This is the same city. Who is walking in the streets, going to farmers markets, going shopping, going to cafes on the 4th Monday?
You're breaking
Nobody.
up again. Sorry.
Why? Because you become afraid because you've had 3 attacks on 3 successive Mondays, all of the same nature. You become afraid, and that affects your lifestyle. That affects your decision making. That's why there's a link between terrorism and terror. The words come from the same root. Is that terrorists want you to be afraid. They want you to stop doing things. They want you to say, "Hey, government, don't invade this country. Don't support this government, because if you do it, we're going to have people killed in our streets, in our cafes, in our shopping centers, in our markets, at our football stadiums." And that's why terrorism works, because it has an effect on your mentality, on your confidence that you can live safely in your society. And this is why if we've done well against the major attacks, that's great. As I said, nobody wants to see mass casualty attacks, but we haven't done so well on the smaller attacks because in truth, they're all but impossible to stop. Unless you're already watching somebody under investigation, it's not going to stop that. If I woke up this morning, Irina, I live in a small village. If I woke up this morning and went to my local supermarket with the intent to carry a knife and start shopping for groceries, who's going to stop me? If I'm already on the radar of law enforcement and security intelligence, the answer is nobody. Now, I want to state the record. I have no intention of doing that. I don't want people all of a sudden calling me a word that Phil Gurski is going to start killing people in his little village. But the point I'm trying to make is that small scale attacks are so simple to plan and so simple to carry out, but they have a disproportionate effect on our societies. Yes, 9/11 was catastrophic, but also the attacks, the 7/7 attacks in Britain, 51 people killed, 700 wounded, Barcelona, etc., etc. Even when you see beheadings and the British military, where basically the guy showed his bloody hands and the knife after he beheaded this young soldier. That kind of image. He's on an ordinary street. People are walking by and he's beheading somebody. What effect does that have on people? It has a huge effect on people. And that's why terrorists do those types of things. This is why it's been because they want to frighten us. They'll do things that no normal human would do because they're trying to make a point. And they feel that they can get us to change our routines, our lives, then the effect that they've won.
To some extent, then, these smaller attacks have proven to be at least as effective, if not more so, than the big splashy mass casualties, because they kind of create this ongoing sense of trauma that does not quite heal, and this kind of everyday, tension that's impossible to fully put behind and very difficult to predict and stop, unlike bigger and more rare attacks that take a lot of planning, could be disrupted, and so forth. So at the same time, though, it seems to have lulled the society into a false sense of security. There's the sense, okay, we have these throat cutters and random attackers who are individuals radicalized online or in the mosque or whatever, but we are good at disrupting cells. We are good at, figuring out bigger conspiracies because there's a mass communication. It's harder to hide. So we are all good and can focus on other things. Do you think this is a sign that we are not prepared for another wave of bigger attacks should they come?
Possibly. I think what worries me is that, we're talking about terrorism here. You and I are speaking in August of 2023. We have the Russian war in Ukraine, which is on the headlines for a year and a half right now. We have China's actions around the world, including here in Canada. They interfered with our elections. They're harassing Canadians of Chinese descent to not criticize the Communist Party. Our security services are being asked to do more and more and more things. And they're getting more and more resources. Yes, you disrupt large scale for reasons the easier it is to penetrate. You can get a human source in there. You can use surveillance. You can go to court and get a warrant to intercept communications. Those are all very good things. Whereas if you're selling a person, that's much more difficult to disrupt.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have also this notion, and Donald Trump even said back in 2019, ISIS is dead. Well, most things Donald Trump said is wrong. ISIS is not dead. I just saw an estimate this morning that in Iraq and Syria alone, there's between 5,000 and 8,000 ISIS. 8,000 ISIS terrorists in Iraq and Syria. That doesn't include how many in Afghanistan and how many are in Nigeria and Mozambique and Somalia and the Sahel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we've had these experts and officials tell us, don't worry anymore. We got them. We killed Baghdadi. We killed Bin Laden. These people aren't posing threats anymore. And some of it maybe also people want to hear success. They want to believe that things are going well. And if their leaders say, you know what, done. ISIS is no longer a threat to our security. Okay, thank you. That's great news. Congratulations, well done. I'm not going to worry about ISIS anymore. And we get lulled into getting a false sense of confidence. Again, I'm not trying to make people afraid. All I'm saying is that if you read the news, as I do on a daily basis, credible sources about who's doing what where, the only conclusion you can draw, unless I'm missing a whole bunch of data. And a couple of years ago, it was last year, I actually had a series of blogs on my website where I looked at all terrorism around the world on a weekly basis. How many attacks, who carried them out, how many casualties, et cetera, et cetera. Did it for about weeks. In those 12 weeks, 99% of all the attacks were jihadi. Not far right, not left wing, not fascists, not anarchists, not whatever. They were jihadis. And if I did the same study today, I'm pretty confident it would still be 99% of all attacks are jihadi in nature. But because they happen in Mali and Central African Republic and Somalia and Balochistan, people in the West don't care. That's off your radar. That's across the world. I can't even find Mali on a map. What do I care about Mali? And as a consequence, these groups are allowed to proliferate, and they inspire people. Even here in Canada, United States, people are inspired. The Americans just arrested a guy in Philadelphia, a kid, 17 years old, inspired by Al Qaeda. He was planning active terrorism in the United States. So kudos to the FBI, great job, guys. But how many other people are like him out there? Because they take inspiration from these groups. I think as humans, either looking for a good news story or we want things explained to us in ways that we can comprehend. And we don't like to dwell on the details. So if a national security expert assures us that jihad is a yesterday threat, so I don't have to worry about it anymore, right? They're not going to do the research. They're not going to do the reading. They're not going to understand what's happening around the world. They just care what happens in their own backyard. Their own backyard is still at risk.
There's another, false kind of statement that we hear a lot from public officials, which is that state actors and non-state actors, groups like Al Qaeda, ISIS, that there is no cooperation, that state actors, even adversarial state actors, are just as interested in vanquishing these threats to social order as we are. As a result, we are often lulled into cooperation with adversarial intelligence agencies or simply refusing to look at the funding of these groups or any potential cooperation. To what extent is the state benefiting? I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but at the very least, some adversarial state actors or regional state actors benefit from these groups existing in whatever way, and to what extent has this been similarly understated as claiming these groups are not, are not influential or have been vanquished to begin with?
There's no question that historically states have sponsored non-state actors because it's their interest to do so. They use if you use a non-state actor, there's plausible deniability. That was the group we had nothing to do with. But they're providing arms, they're providing money, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, states have interests, and if it's in the state's interest to cooperate with whomever is going to act to help you defeat, hit, vanquish whatever your enemy, of course you're going to work with them. I mean, we've all done that. All states have done that. They have backside. Look at the Americans with the Contras in the 1980s in Nicaragua. I was in Nicaragua in the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan said these were freedom fighters. No, they weren't. They were terrorists. They were a state-sponsored terrorist group, sponsored by the Americans to try to overthrow the Sandinista government. That's the only way you can explain it. So, states make decisions for all kinds of reasons. The bottom line is that they want to preserve and, if possible, expand their interests. And if by using another actor, financing them, controlling them, directing them, whatever, can help expand their risks, of course that's going to happen. And you raise a really good point. After 9/11, and I'm using the sort of collective we, the West in general, began to work with all kinds of agencies and all kinds of countries that normally we would not have worked with. But the sheer size of 9/11, the sheer casualty count, led many to believe we had no choice. We would talk to countries that we felt we could somehow work at some level with to try to defeat this enemy. I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. My career in intelligence began during the Cold War. And of course, the Cold War ended in the early 1990s with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. After 9/11, Russia became a partner. They became part of the G7, became the G8. We welcomed them into the G8. And because we felt we had common interests. Russia had a problem with Islamist terrorism, Chechnya, parts of Central Asia. We felt we could, collaborate to meaningfully interaction against these enemies. Now look at, now we're 23. Does anybody think today that Russia is a partner? That Russia is an ally? No, we're not quite at the temperature of the Cold War, and I hope we never get there, but there's a high degree of tension, and you don't think for a minute that Putin would use actors that could advance his interests against the West, whether it's in Ukraine or in the Baltic states or wherever? Of course he would. That's the kind of man he is. But the lesson is that we forget our history. The Cold War ended. Francis Fukuyama famously said, "At the end of history, we have proven to be dominant. Democracy is superior to, oligarchy or is superior to dictatorships or communists, whatever kind of thing." And we decided that period of history is over. We can move on from it. No, you can't. In the same way, jihadis have been declared dead. They're not dead. They're still out there, and they're still growing in some parts of the world. I guess it's part of the human brain or part of the human mind that bothers me, that we can't understand that threats never really go away. They will, maybe they'll increase or decrease at different periods of time, but they never disappear. And you have to make sure that you have resources dedicated to monitor those threats, just in the same way that, in signals intelligence, it was all about the Soviet Union, and for justifiable reasons. It was the Cold War. It was mutually assured destruction, et cetera, et cetera. Then we decided, well, the Cold War is over. We don't have to worry about that anymore. Now, if we had a crystal ball back in 1991, we would have realized we couldn't say that. But it just seems to be it's wise to always keep sort of at least half open on the threats that you think about away, because they will inevitably ride in at some point.
Speaking of, inaccurate information, or in this case, I would say complete disinformation. One of the reasons people thought Russia could be some plausible counterpart in the so-called war on terror, so-called because it's a ridiculous. Terror is a tactic. How can you fight a tactic of terrorism? It was never obviously going to succeed if you define it that way. It cannot, by definition. But leaving aside the word choice, Russia officially banned Muslim Brotherhood and similar organizations. Unofficially, it has embraced and invited Hamas. And mosques, including radical mosques, are extremely fast growing across the entire country, including right in Moscow. And Putin, of course, had no qualms about cooperating with Chechen Islamists to play a role that ended up with the staging of terrorist attacks that brought Putin to the pinnacle of power where he is now. So clearly, not only is there a willingness to cooperate, but we don't even know to what degree Russia itself is able to control that narrative, to what degree they themselves, how far along have they gotten into these relationships, and whether they're even capable of extracting themselves from these dependencies in particular regimes. These Islamist groups in Russia, why I'm bringing this up, are naturally anti-border. They're not nationalist by definition, which means they also can be used to counter national liberation movements by various ethnic minorities in Russia. So they play that use, as Islamists have played the role against communists and against nationalist movements in the Middle East and elsewhere in the past. But to what extent do you think Russia can ultimately control that process? To what extent can we potentially see Islamists coming out of Russia rather than just Central Asia and Africa in the future decades to come?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I have a definitive answer for you, but I think if you look at Putin's actions over the past 20 years, there's only one conclusion that you can draw. He has one goal only, and that is to reconstruct, to resurrect the Soviet Union and its influence that it had for 70 years before the end of the Cold War. And he will do whatever he has to do that. So what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Chechnya, what's happening in other republics along the border. He has a great deal of influence, in Kazakhstan. With the invasion of Ukraine, he can invade Kazakhstan more. Well, speaking, and they're being just the same logic about Ukraine. You talk about the genocide of Russian, complete bullshit, but that's he could use Kazakhstan to justify an invasion of Kazakhstan for Russian interests. It's a use for any actor that's his cause. The dangerous part, of course, is that once that genie bottle, it's really hard to get back in. And Russia has suffered jihadi attacks in the past. I think Moscow theater attack, I forget what year it was, but it was a catastrophic one. More so because of the response by the security service. I think the security service response killed more people than the jihadis did. But I don't want to be, too critical, because you do what you have to do in this situation. But I don't think that anyone should be so naive, as you put it, that Putin and his government will do whatever it has to do to gain that primary goal, which is to regain Soviet glory. They see the last 30 years as a disaster. Russia went from, the leader of a vast empire, which was called the Soviet Union, to very much a backward player, not influential at all, uh, riven with organized crime, money exiting the country, uh, violence was up. The country was not well respected. They were almost dismissed as sort of a second world country, even a third world country at some point. And someone says, I can't accept that. I need to go back to the days where we're neck and neck with the United States, the most powerful nation on the planet. Whether or not he can do that will remain to be seen. But what's happening in Ukraine and Central Asia are classic evidence, as far as I'm concerned, that that's what his ultimate goal is. Which the Baltic states are so worried right now because they're so small. And if Russia decided to advance or mass troops on their border, yes, they're part of NATO, and that's an important part of the calculus. But it wouldn't take long for Russia to redominate the Baltic states, given the overwhelming advantage they have in terms of military might. So I think at the end of the day, he will lie in bed with whomever he needs to lie in bed with if he thinks it's going to be to his advantage. But again, be careful, because later on, sometimes that person comes back to do things that are not necessarily in your favor.
Aside from Russia itself and whatever happens within its borders, there's another issue, which is Russia exports its foreign policy in the form of assorted PMCs like Wagner to gain footholds and influence and relationships and access to natural resources all over the world, including in particular right now Africa. And Wagner is there to prop up some of these Western African regimes, the juntas that have taken over in an anti-European, anti-American backlash, and nominally these Wagner facilitators, first of all, they have not been particularly great in confronting jihadis in Mozambique and elsewhere. Second, they themselves have a bad rep for human rights abuses. And third, it is not beyond a point of, since they themselves are busy recruiting whoever they can in those places, it's not beyond imagination that some of the terrorist groups may eventually cut deals with them and essentially develop an understanding in terms of power sharing and territorial sharing and being included in some forms. So to what extent do you foresee this horrible combination of Russian and possibly in the future other state PMCs and these terrorist groups in various regions where US has very little policy and leadership, for lack of a better word?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to be careful, Irina. I mean, I'm certainly not a Wagner Group specialist, but my understanding, first of all, I'm puzzled. I'm puzzled why African countries have turned to Wagner as their counterterrorism partner of choice. They've kicked the UN out, they've kicked the French out, they've kicked everybody out, and they've settled on Wagner. The Wagner Group is concerned about one thing and one thing only, and that's the Wagner Group. The allegations, or they're stronger than allegations. The proof of them, in terms of minerals, in terms of making money in countries, we know that's exactly what they're doing right there. And these countries see them as a preferable partner with whom to work against jihadis. I'm sorry, I don't understand it. Is it the anti-colonial wave that's it's become so stupid that you would abandon European colonials for Russian colonials? Is this what these states are doing right now? I don't understand it. Just doesn't make any sense to me. And there's no question that Wagner Group has been, as you said, an extremely brutal group. They've engaged in massive human rights violations wherever they have been. And the jihadis probably kind of respect them in a way, because the jihadis have engaged in massive human rights violations wherever they are, whether all through the Sahel in Eastern and Western Africa. So at some point, there could be some kind of a deal struck. Islamic State, when they had the caliphate in Iraq, made hundreds of millions of dollars off stolen art, stolen archaeological artifacts, et cetera. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility that certain jihadi groups would see Wagner as a partner kind of thing. But you also raised a really good point. Wagner has failed ever gone. I'm not aware of any true Wagner successes against jihadi groups. In Mozambique, they were embarrassed. They were killed by an Islamic State affiliate in Cabo Delgado in the northeastern part of Mozambique. Their track record is not a good one on any level. Human rights, success, uh, dealing with local governments, et cetera, which again makes me wonder why in heaven's name, the Nigerians and the Malians think that Wagner is somebody you want to work with. This making, it's completely incomprehensible to me. I'm not saying that the French and the United Nations were any better necessarily. I mean, the jihadi groups are still around, but at least they had some kind of respect for people's lives and some kind of respect for universal values. And then, of course, Wagner basically against Putin himself a couple of months ago. And what does that mean in terms of internal Russian politics between the Wagner group and the Putin government? I don't know. It was a fascinating story at the time, and we didn't know how it was going to end. It seems to have ended for now. But bottom line is the Wagner group will continue to travel to parts of the world. They will steal resources. They will steal minerals. They will brutally kill who gets in their way. And governments seem to be okay with that. And we know for a fact that I was going to say, we know for a fact that there's one way to ensure that terror does not end. That's keep killing people. You can't raise about the war in a stupid term. In fact, my fourth was called an end to the war on terrorism. Declaring war as a noun is dumb. War on drugs, war on poverty, war on teenage pregnancy, whatever. Dumb. And yet we're stuck with it. And Wagner Group's not going to be any more successful against the jihadis in Mali or Niger or Central African Republic than MINUSMA was, or other UN missions, or the French or the Germans, or whatever kind of thing. But maybe at the end of the day, we talked a lot about personalities today. If the president of Niger, who's now a military official, has a way to get money from this, what does he care? Right? The Wagner Group will make him a very, very rich man by cutting the deals they make when they steal all these resources. I'm sorry to say that, but at the end of the day, I think that's what it's all about.
There's a couple of points that I feel is missing from contemporary counterterrorism discourse when examining these very issues. First, while Wagner itself has actually been inspired by very Nazi-adjacent individuals, Prigozhin's methods specifically are actually very similar to ISIS in terms of the using the hammer and the public brutal execution of whoever crosses him. This is very much an ISIS-like tactic, and I'm curious to what extent there has been a conscious as opposed to subconscious exchange of information warfare. That's one point that I'm curious. The other issue is organized crime networks. Russia has perfected the relationship between intelligence, organized crimes, private kleptocratic interests, and so forth. But what we've seen in Africa, in other parts of the world, their interest in contraband, in smuggling gold and natural resources, this is the same thing as Hezbollah in particular is quite adept at doing. And Hezbollah is another organization that has resurfaced in connection with Russia's Middle Eastern peace, diplomatic efforts. And I'm curious to what extent these, PMC and formal terrorist organization interactions and will either clash as they compete to resources, or whether they'll come to an understanding and will actually their organized crime networks and their methodologies will actually sustain each other and come together towards using these various criminal enterprises to support their respective goals.
Yeah, I don't. I definitely don't know very little of anything about organized crime, so I'm gonna have to be very careful in my response. I think it completely is within the realm of possibility. You've got areas of the world that are basically ungovernable. There is no real sense of order. There's no law. There's no system of actually managing a society. It's like if I can use a terrible term, it's like the Wild Wild West, because in the 19th century, where essentially the strongest person dictated what the conditions were to be. And I think Wagner Group, which I would agree with you, is basically organized crime, as far as I can tell. Again, I'm not a Wagner specialist, but these areas of the world are ripe for that kind of collaboration. There's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot of very important minerals, natural resources that can be stolen, and for multiple billions of dollars. And organized crime groups, they know about this kind of stuff, and so of course they're going to go there, and they're going to work with whomever they need to gain those types of funds, make themselves richer. So I think the points you raise are very valid ones. I think it's entirely possible, if not maybe even probable, that we're going to see these alliances created because there's money to be made. And nobody cares about the human condition. Nobody cares what happens to the locals. They're just in the way. And if we have to slaughter them in brutal ways, you talk about some of the methodology that Wagner has used. I'm not sure if they were emulating ISIS or there's any kind of connection, but there's no question that ISIS was very successful in lowering the bar to brutality.
Mm-hmm.
Think about it. What does it take to behead somebody? A very sharp knife. An average person, I'm hoping, would never even contemplate beheading somebody. The sheer horror of, having someone screaming, their heads being sawn off. I think most people would just, they can't even contemplate the possibility. But the sheer propaganda value of that. So not only are you beheading somebody, you're filming it while it's happening. Then you're putting it on YouTube before it gets taken down or goes onto the dark web where it's never taken down. I think groups like Wagner say, hey, we can do that too. And again, as I said earlier, once you intimidate enough of the population by using truly brutal methods, you think you've achieved your goals. People are now afraid of you, which means they'll do anything to stop you. And if that means cooperating with you, giving you a free hand to work in a certain area, then they're going to do it because they don't want to, they themselves don't want to be brutally beheaded and put it on video kind of thing. And that's where groups like, Islamic State and its provinces and Wagner Group are very successful. They're basically getting people to do things they wouldn't normally do out of fear.
Indeed, and Prigozhin, above being a militia leader, he's not actually a trained military person. He is,
No.
however, very successful at propaganda, and Wagner has been more successful at propaganda than at almost anything else. So I don't believe in coincidences. I do believe that at the very least they appreciate the methods and the successes, and they're capable of learning and adapting them. Whether or not that will ultimately lead to any sort of coordination, remains to be seen, and it's too early to speculate. But given that they're certainly willing to go down to that level, it's also not within the realm of possibility at this point.
Yeah.
And that brings me back to a more kind of general question to wrap up the discussion, the myth making about terrorism and the nature of terrorism. A lot of what I've observed from very shallow kind of discussion comes from when people try to enter the realm of interpretation rather than focus on very detailed observation and very detailed pattern making and kind of looking and just seeing what they can detect. Instead, there's a lot of extrapolation and assigning of moral agencies and motives and things like that, instead of just simply focusing on observable facts and cataloging as much as possible. Is that, in your opinion, part of the problem with much of the counterterrorism or terrorism study field, that people are just want too much to be, to be able to speak for the terrorists as opposed to just speak about them?
It's a great point. I'm going to give you a concrete example that is from Canada. That's one I know very well, and it really speaks to what you're talking about this very shallow analysis that is completely inaccurate. So over the past couple of years in Canada, at the government level, you cannot use the term Islamist terrorism or jihadism. It's been banned. It's been banned because some people think it's racist or that it's Islamophobic in nature. So what the Canadian government has decided is groups like Islamic State, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, Jamaat Islamiyah, the list goes, there's thousands of Islamist terrorist groups around the world. The Canadian government has decided to call them religiously motivated violent extremists. Okay, RMVE for short. There's several problems with that term. First of all, the rest of the known universe calls them jihadis or Islamist terrorists. Only Canada doesn't do that. Secondly, Islamic State, which is one of these RMVE groups, is not solely religiously motivated. It's ideologically and also politically motivated. Those are the other terms that Canada uses: ideologically motivated, which means far, and politically motivated, which means I have no idea. I've lost track. Secondly, a lot of people say, well, if you call it religiously motivated, you're suggesting that Islamic State has legitimate religious reasons for doing so. And a lot of Muslims say, well, we've been telling you for decades, Islamic State is not Islamic. That's why they call it Daesh, which is simply an Arabic term, Adal Islamiyya fil Iraq wa Shams, which means the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So actually, the word Islamic is still in there. It happens to be there in Arabic rather than English, which is kind of stupid. Muslims are saying, well, you're calling it religious, and we're telling you it's not religious. But in actual fact, as we said, it is religious. It happens to be non-normative, non-moderate religion kind of thing. So here we have analysis that makes it almost forbidden to use the term Islamist terrorism in Canada. When you do that, first of all, it's bad analysis. Second of all, you're ignoring the problem. If I call it religiously motivated, what religion? Are Buddhists beheading people? Are, I don't know, Catholics beheading people? The list goes on and on and on. No, the fact is today, as I've said many times in the podcast, the number one ideological motivation behind terrorism is jihadism. That's what the facts say, unless I'm reading the facts wrong. So we're being led to use terminology that is inaccurate, unhelpful, and as a consequence, if you don't see the word jihadis, or don't see the word Islamist terrorists regularly in communications, that leads you to believe it's not important anymore. And we've said that that's categorically false. So we have a government too afraid to use accurate terminology, and by doing so, the public is not as well informed. And this is why you get people saying, "Oh, Al-Qaeda's still around? What? I thought they were dead. Islamic State's still around. Donald Trump told us they were dead." As an analyst, you really have only one requirement, and that's to be true to the data. You can have your own interpretations of what it means, your own theories, your own spins, but you can't make up your data. That's called misinformation. And so if we stick to the data we have, and it's all open source data, by the way. I left intelligence 8.5 years ago. I don't have access to anything classified anymore. I haven't for a long time. All my data is open source. If I can find this stuff in open source, then anybody can. You don't have to have a security clearance to find this stuff. And, as I said earlier, right-wing terrorism was really that, which everybody says it is. Where in heaven's name are all the attacks? Yes, there have been some, absolutely. But on a day-to-day basis, and I have the data to show it, they don't even remotely approach jihad in terms of numbers of attacks, numbers of casualties, and effects on society. So if you're going to engage in shitty analysis, don't. Give us what is actually happening. Use the data that's real, and then we can make up our minds on what to do about it.
That is a fair point. And speaking of good analysis, what's next for you? What are you looking for, given that these threats are continuing, there are new combinations emerging every day, and it seems to me people are too busy arguing about terms and what sounds better and less insulting than about actually addressing the reality of and not investing the resources into combating the actual problem.
What's new for me? What's next for me? Same old, same old. I keep reading on a daily basis. I've been reading the news on a daily basis for going on 45 years now. I don't have any intention to stopping. I'm active on social media, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. I share my views on things. I share facts. I share news about attacks with people of whatever political motivation. I don't only talk about jihadis. If there's an attack by a neo-Nazi group, I'll report it. If there's an attack by Buddhist terrorists, and yes, there's such thing as Buddhist terrorists in Myanmar and in Sri Lanka, I'll talk about it. I'm trying to get facts out to people so they can make up their own minds. So I'm not writing on terrorism per se. I think I've written six books on the topic, done thousands of interviews with media in Canada, around the world. I've written hundreds of blogs and podcasts. There's not much else I can say about terrorism that I haven't already said. But you're right. It is changing. It is morphing. Still with a jihadi emphasis. I'll still follow it very carefully. I'm interested in the topic. I have been professionally for 40 years now. Going as long as if people want to entertain what I'm saying, great. I'm not in a position to influence anybody. I don't have a position in that sense, but I want people to be informed. Irina, when you work in intelligence, there's only one reason why you go to work in the morning: to get the best information possible, to pass it to people who make decisions, and hope that they can make better decisions based on the evidence. I may not be in intelligence anymore because I won't work with open source information, but my mission is the same: give people the facts so they can make better decisions, whether it's personal decisions or government decisions or investment decisions or whatever. That's all I want to do. So I'll keep going for some time yet. My children laugh at me when I tell them that I'm retired. They say, "Yeah, if that's retirement, then you've clearly reinvented the term." I mean, I've written 7 books in 8 years, so that's clearly not retirement. No, you know what, Irina, I do it because I enjoy it. And when it becomes not enjoyable, I'll find something else to do. I have other interests in life, aside from my grandkids and that kind of thing. There's other things I want to do, but I still have a passion for this kind of reporting. And so I'll keep looking at it for at least the foreseeable future. Let's just leave it at that.
Well, thank you so much for your time, for your valuable insights, and for a great discussion, which I personally really enjoyed, and I hope and I think our audience has as well. For everyone watching this, we'll be back again next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. as usual. And thank you for tuning in tonight for our conversation about myths and realities of terrorism with Phil Gurski. And hope you'll be joining us again in the future. Have a great night.